Now, without further ado, it delights me to introduce you to our first keynote speaker, who for this Life Summit 2020. So please give a round of applause, virtually, for Clara Bonaci, Senior Director of U.S. Health and Life Sciences at Microsoft.
Thank you, Todd. I'm very excited to be here speaking to you about topics I'm very passionate about, and I'm hoping that we can continue the discussion by the chat feature afterwards so I can get everyone else's perspectives as well. As Todd said, my name is Clara Bonaci. I'm the Senior Director of U.S. Health and Life Sciences at Microsoft, and I specialize in working with pharma, biotech, and life science companies of all sizes on their digital journey. Pharma holds a spot near and dear to my heart because I worked at a large global pharmaceutical company in clinical operations for oncology trials for 4 years prior to coming to Microsoft, and I am very much still connected with that community. I'm sure many of you are as connected, if not more connected, to the biotech and pharma and healthcare industry as well. And I'm sure you've noticed a shift in how these organizations are handling COVID, how they're shifting, and just overall just how much has changed during the last 9 months. And many of you probably work in the pharma industry in particular. You either have colleagues in the industry, you know someone, it's probably touched your life in some way. And I know you have your own opinions of that as well. So I'd love to hear what you all think. And I'd like to share a little bit of what I've seen on a global scale that has shaped my opinion that COVID-19 really might be the biggest and the best impetus for change in the history of big pharma and biotech, and probably healthcare overall. Big pharma and biotech has consistently had pretty negative connotations, I think, in general. I think we can all agree on this. And despite global access programs and philanthropic campaigns that they've run and the very touching commercials that we continuously see, they're kind of depicted as price gouging and soulless organizations still. And I think that within the organizations themselves, they're typically very averse to big, drastic digital innovations. During my time in pharma, practically everything was done by Excel spreadsheet or internally created databases and CTMS systems. And just to note, I was not there that long ago. I was at the large pharmaceutical company only 2 years ago. And digitization was and still is a really slow process for this industry and for the highly regulated nature of that business. I think that was used almost as a reason or an excuse to the slow progress that they were making in technology as a whole as an industry. And I think we all know that it costs billions of dollars to bring a single drug to market. It typically takes on average a full decade from inception to bringing it to market. And within that process, 9 out of 10 promising drug molecules failed during that whole time. But it was working still. Drugs were still coming to market, patients were still being helped. So why change what's not broken, really? I think that's when the global pandemic happened. And that pandemic really put a microscope on big pharma in particular in a very different way. And in my opinion, I think it was almost in a positive way, really. Help find a life-saving cure or a vaccine to COVID-19. Globally and locally, people were viewing pharma and academic clinical research as the group that would kind of get us out of this mess that we found ourselves in 2020. And there still is talk on the news that a vaccine will kind of turn life back to normal, at the very least make it a little bit more manageable. And it was a very different narrative than where pharma had been in the past. I think many of the tried and true methods for drug discovery, for clinical trials, for data collection and regulatory submissions, they couldn't really continue in the same way due to this pandemic. Everyone was working from home, as I'm sure many of us still are. Hospitals were completely overwhelmed. Patients couldn't really come in for routine visits, let alone clinical trials. And because of this, we saw huge progress in many areas in the industry, whether that was expedited use of virtual clinical trials, remote patient monitoring, or IOMT devices. We saw a push for onshoring of manufacturing practices and manufacturing automation, as well as remote work options for organization employees, and so much more. So there was, and there still is, this immense pressure on large pharma and biotech organizations to really rise to this occasion, both in their ability to either manufacture those needed drugs, as we're seeing in Gilead's case, to fail fast and develop these new therapeutics faster than before, and to really beef up their supply chain resilience to ensure that no mistakes are made throughout that whole process. And really, the entire world is watching what every large biotech, pharma, and health system is doing right now, more than it ever has been. And I think because of this pressure, we saw an increase in collaborations and partnerships, which I love. We saw that between life science organizations, but also across industry. So pharma companies, they needed to be collaborating and partnering with governments and tech companies and academic medical centers. And this was seen on a global basis, especially as region by region had shifts in the epicenters of COVID. A great example that we saw was competitor companies really working together to try to ramp up production of hydroxychloroquine despite the lack of direct advantage that it would be to each individual company. They were kind of doing it, well, one, obviously for the press, but of course for the greater good. And this collaboration typically happens, but never at the speed or the urgency that we had seen during this pandemic. And finally, we were actually seeing that fail fast mentality that I mentioned earlier, that lots of large companies kind of talk about and kind of get you in the door with, but we don't really see normally. This time we were seeing it, and everyone was working towards a very similar goal for the exact same indication. These companies also had to take a hard look at how this affected their supply chain. They enlisted whole departments dedicated to risk management for choosing partners, diversifying locations of partners or manufacturing sites during this time, and also for future production. They knew this was not going to be a short-term solution, and they needed a strategy for the future to ensure that they had a very sufficient local supply chain as well as global. And obviously with this comes the intersection of technology, my favorite part. They needed digital tools for manufacturing, for the automation, to create more agility, really try to decrease the need for thousands of employees in manufacturing warehouses, because that wasn't an option anymore due to social distancing protocols. And because of this shift that we saw, and we will continue to see a shift in the workplace in this industry. So I think the workforce is really shifting more than just a shift to remote work. Manual skills will be less desirable than technical skills, meaning that the monotonous tasks of the past will probably be replaced by automation and digital tools, and knowledge workers will be spending their time on interpreting the data and decision-making based on that data and analytics. So we're going to see a shift, not just in remote work, but also in just how we're working and the kind of skills that we need to do the work. And from the trial perspective, the use of virtual trials, which had started to gain momentum before the pandemic, it quickly became really the only way to continue doing these trials, to continue bringing other drugs to market during the pandemic. And that was especially true for trials run globally, and that's mainly because countries with changing COVID-19 protocols and guidelines, they all needed to be pretty standardized. And these virtual trials really brought with them kind of a whole suite of patient-centric technologies that we had not seen as mainstream before. These included wearables and telemedicine capabilities and things that, right now we kind of take for granted and we're happy with. I think everyone is probably okay with doing virtual visits with their provider. It makes it a little bit easier, less commuting. And these are definitely not new concepts to the industry, but the pandemic is kind of what forced them into being as mainstream in the clinical trial and pharma world, but also in healthcare in general. So I think all of this to say that COVID-19, despite as devastating as it has been, truly has been the main driving factor behind these changes, specifically in pharma, and how quickly they were adopted. And I believe that this shift that we're seeing in the industry will continue. I think AI will continue to be more integrated into every part of drug discovery and the whole life cycle of drug discovery, from candidate discovery to using AI for trial recruitment or enrollment and precision genomics. I think the biotech industry is getting enough momentum from this pandemic to continue this innovation in their technology journey. And I'm very confident that the promising molecules that will be determined faster, clinical trial enrollment will take less time, hopefully, and bringing therapeutic drugs to market will be overall less expensive and just faster. I think big partnerships and coalitions will be more and more prevalent. Tech companies working with pharma and health systems will probably be the norm. And all of this will hopefully reduce the time to overall innovation in healthcare. So with that, I think my 10 minutes are close to being up, but I want to close by saying that the shift that we're seeing in healthcare industry as a whole, because of this pandemic, I think will be felt for years to come. And with that comes immense future opportunity and responsibility as well. I'm very hopeful and excited to see what new healthcare and pharma startups come out of this. And I know that many of you in this virtual room will probably be part of it. So I'll hop in the chat to read what you all have to say, and thank you for letting me share your thoughts today.